Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. Today, I am chatting with Dr. Stéphane Bouchard about using virtual reality as a therapeutic tool. Stéphane is the Director of Psychology at the University of Quebec in Ottawa and is the world leader in VR therapies and based in Canada. Welcome, Stéphane. I'm so delighted to have you back on board.
Thank you, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Stéphane, you were a guest a few weeks ago, and we were talking about video-based telepsychotherapy. But today we're going to be talking about virtual reality or VR, and how it's used as a therapeutic tool. Can you tell me how you got into researching VR?
Yeah, I'll make not of a too long story, but it's going to be a personal story. So when I was a kid, my parents took a picture of myself as I watching TV when human landed on the moon for the first time, and I said I want to be an astronaut. So I want to be doing discovery, research, and going other places and being on the moon. So my goal was to be an astronaut. Um, And then we realized at elementary school that I poor eyesight. I'm actually -12 in both eyes, so I can't see my hand. It's that far. So I figured I would miss the moon if I'm the pilot. So that was my reasoning as a child. So then I decided to be a doctor because I figured my father was a general practitioner, a GP, and I figured, okay, I can't be the pilot, but on the moon they will need doctors. So I could be the doctor and still go to the moon. And then I tried that. And then because it was not popular at the time to diagnose that, but I do have ADHD, not diagnosed and not medicated, but at early school I had poor notes, poor grades. So at some point it was clear that I could not be a doctor. So I figured, okay, well, what else could I do? Maybe I could become a psychologist. So it helps people. I was forgetting about the moon because sometimes you kind of grow older. But I figured, okay, I got to help people. And as I was studying about anxiety and anxiety disorders, how we help people face what they're afraid of. We're going to talk about it plenty today. Um, so then the movie The Lawnmower Man came out, which is about virtual reality and someone with mental disabilities getting into a computer, and it's a sci-fi movie. But I was a sci-fi buff because of all this um, moon thing. So Star Wars, Star Trek was a big fan. Then in 1994, a paper came out by Barbara Rothbaum, where she published with North and Cobalt, a group of researchers from the US. They published how we could use virtual reality to do exposure. I figured, wow, that would be so great. So 1994, I got like the hook for virtual reality, but it was so expensive. It was impossible to do. And then through the other research I was doing on video conference-based psychotherapy, I attended a conference, and then I realized that we could actually modify video games. So it would be a cheap way to create virtual reality. So I was modifying video games to create virtual environments, and then I ended up beginning a research career in virtual reality, and it grew from little really small lab to a well-funded research team, then to a Canada research chair, then to a huge lab where we develop virtual environments, we test them, we do the experimental studies, we do the randomized control trial, we publish, and then we actually provide these environments through a company called In Virtuo, where we can actually commercially distribute these virtual environments. We have this full line of research. So essentially now, I'm not an astronaut, but I'm part of the sci-fi mood because when I began doing research, it was really science fiction, and I'm not in the moon on the moon, but I'm on Mars or everywhere else doing with these virtual environments. So I can accomplish my dream as a kid, and it lead me to the research that we're talking today.
Excellent. You don't even have to get into a rocket ship.
No, it's safer, much safer.
Much safer, and you can do it while you're sitting at your desk. Brilliant. Last time when we spoke about video telepsychotherapy and virtual based reality, you kind of gave us a definition of what those two are and how they're different. Could you summarize that for us again, please?
Yeah, well, in video conference-based psychotherapy or telepsychotherapy, we are seeing each other, or you're seeing the patient, or the patient is seeing the psychiatrist, or the doctor, or the psychologist, and in real time we have this video-based interaction, and we do psychotherapy. In virtual reality, it's a bit different. You are immersed, so we can talk about immersion in a few minutes, but you are immersed by stimuli into a world or an environment that is not the real one. It could be a replica of the real world. It could be 3D recreated. It could be done with video camera and 360 videos. But essentially, you are somewhere else, and you feel through this immersion and interaction, because wherever you look, you would see the environment as moving as if it's true, or and then you create the illusion of what we call presence, or this illusion that it's plausible and you're in that place and you really feel these things. These days, it's essentially done through goggles. So people are virtual reality headset, and you put your goggles on and you move around, and you can interact. So by being somewhere else, we can create content where, for psychotherapy at least, we can induce emotions and use these emotions for therapeutic change. And there's tons of application for that. We're going to discuss it for the rest of the talk together. But and you can also practice and learn and overlearn skills. So that's more traditional learning and or rehabilitation. There's different applications. But for psychotherapy, I think the key point is that you really can create a standardized, controllable emotional context, or emotion, or context that would elicit emotions. And that could be used for good, to help people face they're afraid of, deal with cravings, learn about plenty of things.
Your virtual reality lab at the University of Quebec researches several different ways VR can help people who struggle with mental health issues. And it seems there's very little you have not researched within your VR lab. Are you able to talk about some of the main areas of research you and your team cover?
Yeah, I think the main one is anxiety disorders. But we also do studies on body image, and body image, how it relates to how we perceive our body, how it relates to eating disorder, how it relates to obesity. But we also do studies on addiction, on schizophrenia. But to begin with anxiety disorders, uh, I think we need to do a step back just before we get to virtual reality and talk about how we treat anxiety disorders. And there's like hundreds of forms of psychotherapy, and I'm not even getting into medication. But among the forms of psychotherapy, there's one that is repeatedly demonstrated to be effective as effective medication, superior to placebo, and it's called cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. And in CBT, there's lots of things we do. Even for phobias, we take the time to, it is essential to take the time to understand how the person go through her problem, or this problem, where it comes from, how it's lived, why it's maintained, and how it's maintained. So we need to develop a good understanding, a good relationship, a good bond. So we have common goals, and again, good understanding, common understanding of the problem. And then we do other therapeutic strategies. And the key one, and again, it's even before VR, the key one is called exposure. And exposure in the field of anxiety disorders is to help people learn safety. You get this emotional reaction that, oh my God, if I see a spider, or I talk in public, or I stutter during our podcast, that's frightening, that's stressing, that shouldn't happen. And that leads to anxiety. That's normal. The problem with anxiety is we don't like to experience it. Makes sense. Because we don't like to experience it, oftentimes people will avoid it. And by avoiding it, it maintains the perception of threat. It could be more complicated, but if we go to the heart of it, and we'll go back to VR in a second. And there's a we need to also look at how the brain works and the neuroscience of it. And when you perceive something as threatening, there's a part of the brain that deals with emotion, the limbic system, the typical area is called the amygdala, but it reacts very quickly when it perceives something as potentially threatening. Quickly, let's say about 7 to 12 milliseconds, no more. You have an immediate reaction, and then later on, you make sense of it. You kind of process information, and through the prefrontal, the area or the areas of brains where you try to make meanings and talk to yourself, but that comes afterwards. So we get an immediate reaction, very less than 10 or 12 milliseconds, and then the rest unfolds. So when we do exposure, we help people go through emotional experiences where they would progressively confront what they're afraid of to learn safety. It could be done progressively. We could do some behavioral experiment to test whether this will happen or not. But in essence, we're trying to help the amygdala learn safety. Learn that if you stop avoiding, you will learn through experience, which is challenging, that is not dangerous. That's called exposure. So exposure is learning for anxiety disorders, is learning safety by removing avoidance and testing new situations to learn safety. And that has been known for decades. Now VR. The problem with exposure is lots of people don't want to do that. And as a psychotherapist, we don't control what will happen. So fear of flying, I would love the plane when I'm doing exposure with the patient to lift off or take off only when we're ready. I would like to have turbulences, but not today because then you're ready, only tomorrow. But I can't control the environment like that. But you can do that in virtual reality. So it could be standardized. You know what you're going through when you put the goggles on, and the professionals can actually trigger the events only when people are ready for that to learn safety, to lean to safety. So we can use virtual reality to do the exposure. It's less cumbersome. You don't have to go to airports. If I have a patient who's afraid of spiders, I need a spider in my lab. I can have a little plastic spider that's cool, but I would need a live one. Well, you have a patient who's afraid of cows. You probably need a cow in your office. You won't, but you'll get to places like this. So, and that's only phobias. When we think about social anxiety, people who are socially anxious are afraid of the judgment of others. So it means that if you do exposure, you don't need to expose yourself to others, but the judgment of others. It means that, again, in a nutshell, and we take the time to build the alliance and so on, but in the essence, at some point, you need to learn that you're looking silly and it's not that dangerous. That wearing a clown nose, because people who listen to the podcast don't know, but I'm just putting myself on myself on a clown nose. And I see you smile. And of course, we would discuss that you see me smile. You smile watching me. And of course, I'll look a little bit unsettling but that's how I need to learn safety progressively, gradually. But when VR, you could do that with the goggles. No one sees that. There's no breach of confidentiality. And we can also, and we'll talk about that later on, but we can also push the envelope and do exposure in ways that we would not dare do in vivo just because it's too dangerous or too uncomfortable. But then you can also really learn safety through these experiences. So in a nutshell, for anxiety, we develop VR environments to do exposure. We began with phobias, spiders, and we learned lots of things actually with specific phobias about presence, about the ingredients you need to put in the virtual environment. And then we moved to social anxiety disorder. We did pretty nice randomized controlled trial comparing standardized exposure in vivo, you do the real thing, or you do in virtual reality. And it works as well. And actually even a bit better in our case for the exposure in virtual reality, because probably we push exposure a lot. And then the role of alliance, motivation, and so on. And as we grew out of social phobia, we looked at obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. So we've covered all anxiety disorders. Initially, the first environments we developed for spiders, we would put it for free on the web, on my lab's website, because, hey, I do research I want to share. The problem with free material is there's no one to help you with tech support. There's no one to make the updates and so on. So this is where we created a spin-off company I mentioned called In Virtuo, where with the university, we decided to the environments that we develop through public funding, instead of letting them on a tablet, we could actually keep them updated by selling them at a minimal cost and then make sure that they're used throughout the world, which they are now. And profit goes back to the university. But at least we have the full chain of development to the end of the distribution. And then we also did addictions. For addiction, the role exposure is a bit different. And let's talk about addiction if it's okay. For addiction, we'll take for cocaine, for example. In case of cocaine, the patient could be in your therapist and tell you that, yes, I'm in control, everything is fine, I can resist temptation, I can deal with that, my friends could. So at some point, there's so much you can do in your office. And what would be nice is if you can actually offer a line of coke to your patient and say, well, here's a real one. Would you dare taking it? And if they say no, well, you can push a little bit. Hey, come on. No one will know, whatever. Of course, you will never do that. It's not legal. There's tons of ethical implications. But we all know in our mind that patients will face these situations. And this is where the psychotherapy or the material or whatever has been done in psychotherapy will be put to challenge. So why not do it in VR? So in VR, you would have these places where people would offer you drugs or alcohol or tobacco, or in our case, in our studies, gambling addiction, you would have the chance to gambling at slot machines. And even though these stimuli are fake because there's no drug, it's highly conditioned because when people see all the preparations for the drug, it all gets the cravings. So for exposure, you don't want to learn safety because, well, drugs are not safe, but people are using it. And you don't want, just an aside, when we learn safety, we actually learn safety in the context of no threat. So it's kind of correcting an impression that it's not safe. So for alcohol, people will never learn that alcohol is not relaxing or doesn't make you more joyful or whatever, because it does. Cocaine, you'll never learn that cocaine is not making you hyper because that's what it does. So the exposure is for a different purpose. The exposure is actually to have the chance to learn that you can control yourself. You're not a slave to that substance or whatever. You can build on your self-efficacy, your feeling of control. You can put in practice everything with learning therapy, but not when you're calm, when you're emotionally challenged, where it matters the most. And of course, it would be gradual again, but you can see that the goal of exposure is different. It's not to unlearn or learn safety when you learn something else. It's just to learn something totally different. But again, the idea for addiction is to put people in some emotional context where they would get the emotions in the safety of the therapist's office and then practice what they've learned through therapy, put in practice, more challenging and more difficult progressively. Again, the therapist controls the game, if I might say, and then learn to more success. And studies now are trying to look at the success for addiction.
I'd love to sort of come back to some of those later on during our chat, but I want to chat about presence. You've mentioned that a few times, and it's a really interesting concept within VR, which is not similar to other environments. And presence is where a person becomes fully immersed in the VR world and almost forget about the existing world around them. And there's lots of YouTube videos that show how people in VR can kind of completely forget where they are and run into walls and run into TVs and knock over Christmas trees and things like that. But can you explain a bit more about what presence means and why it's such an important part of VR therapy?
Yeah, presence is very important, but I'll make a few comments and hopefully debunk a few myths. It is important, it is key to make the difference between immersion and presence. And there's one seminal paper that I won't mention where the author says these two are synonyms. And there's no synonyms in science. So they're not exactly the same thing. And it led to confusion in the field. So if you put your hand in water, you're surrounded by water, you're immersed by water. These are the stimuli. That's not what you feel, that's what's happening. So being immersed is being actually subjected to these stimuli. Would be video often, but VR is not only video. There's VR for blind people. There's often sound, not always, but they could be smell, they could be touch, they could be plenty of other stimuli that are surrounding you as a perceiving body, and that's immersion. And technologies could be more or less immersive. You can have a set of VR goggles that are you field of vision is really small, and one is broader. I see you on a monitor. Right now, I'm not fully immersed because I see my office. So immersion is really the property of the system, the technology. Presence is what you feel when you put your hand and your hand is immersed in water. Presence is your emotions and what you do feel. So yeah, presence is what you feel. And so big difference to make. Second, for decades, there were this big thing about presence and what is presence and how would we conceive it, and is it the second state of mind, well, whatever. And I think we can make it very simple. The artist would say for like the theater of 18th century, the suspension of disbelief. You forget that it's not true and you kind of believe into it. Or more recently, people talked about illusion. The illusion that the experience you have is not going through a media. It's called the illusion of non-mediation, a bit complicated, but still. Or a researcher called Mel Slater mentioned that it's actually two illusions, the plausibility illusion and the place illusion. The place illusion is you forget that you're in the therapist office and you have this illusion that you are in this place. It could be the moon, it could be Mars, or it could be public speaking. And the plausibility illusion is that your brain stopped telling you that it's not realistic and just process the information as if it's true. And that plausibility illusion seems to be, I'm confident, but seems to be related to multisensory integration. When there's many senses that are sending you the same signal, and if it's well sequenced, well synchronized, it makes sense. So if you look outside and look at the cloud, I don't know, you see a sheep, or you see a turtle or whatever. There's no sheep and turtles, but when something is vague, our brain makes sense of it. So that's typical optical illusion or typical illusion. But when you move, what you see follows your movement and it looks credible, and that's the only thing you see because it's more immersive, it kind of makes sense that it is true. So the plausibility illusion is associated with multisensory integration. The place illusions come after that. We have the impression that you're on that location or whatever. So that's presence. There's this notion that presence is essential. I would put nuances there. If people are not present in the virtual environment, they would put the goggles on and say, yeah, it's not good, it's not realistic, blah, blah, blah. So they don't get into the experience. That's true. But as people are getting more and more presence, they get more and more the illusion that it's true and they're there, then the magic of VR occurs. I mean, people process information, and if it be on Hawaii or on a beach or on a moon or Mars, you have the impression you're there. And then you probably have sufficient presence. Because if presence was therapeutic, if presence was key, just feeling present would bring some kind of good outcome. And we see that presence relates to outcome, but not perfectly. And it's actually a condition for psychotherapy to actually, or good psychotherapy or effective psychotherapy, I would call effective exposure in my kind of research, to occur. So if you're sufficiently present, then the brain processes the information as if it's true. You believe you're seeing spiders or whatever, or you don't really believe it 100%, but it's enough to fool the brain. It goes back to my introduction about how emotion works. And because it takes about 7, 10, 12 milliseconds to trigger the limbic system or the amygdala, if you get sufficiently good environment or stimuli to bluff the brain, to give the impression that it's true, people will react with present and they will get anxious or whatever the emotion they have. If it's a drug, they will have a craving or with these virtual environments. So again, a significant nuance is to understand that when you look at the virtual environment as a cybertherapist or as a consumer or as a patient, always remind yourself not to look at the environment or the stimuli from the perspective of a movie artist or a movie critic, where it's imperfect, but through your understanding of mental disorder. And that's been, I think, key in my career is we need to understand how people process some specific stimuli. As two example, people who are afraid of spiders, if you show them a spider like that, which is a plastic spider I'm holding, it's white, it's missing a leg. Yeah, it's not a good spider. But for someone with a phobia, their limbic system is already triggered and they're already anxious. So even though it's not perfectly realistic, it is sufficient to trigger the emotional reaction, and then they get the perception of threat, and then I have this fear, I want to avoid, and you get the whole system activated as if it's true. So then you can conduct the exposure, and it does work. We've shown that us and other labs several times. But other people are afraid of snakes, but not spiders. Well, yeah, it's a bad spider, but it's not a snake. So you need to have the right ingredients in the virtual environment to trigger the emotion reaction. Then people don't have to be perfectly present. It doesn't have to be perfectly realistic, that it works. And just a last example or comment on that is the first environment that we designed for spider phobia that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. We didn't have sufficient funding to do the whole thing. So we modified a violent video game. We remove all the guns and the monsters and everything. And I had a graphic artist that was learning so we could make spiders, but we have no programmers to make the behavior of the spider. So in the game, there was 3 behaviors: a cockroach, crab, and a dog. It means that in our virtual environment, the spider, which is far from realistic, was moving like a cockroaches, like little hunches like this, or sideways only, or like a dog. It would see you and follow you all the time. So nothing of this is typical of the behavior of spider. The treatment worked for these phobics, and there was a documentary made in French here in Canada, and we would see a patient. It was so anxious that he was banging his head behind the wall. It was really present. He was fully immersed. He got the impression it was real, and he was actually able to learn safety progressively over time. That's the detail of the psychotherapy, which is important. But the example there is that there was also an entomologist, someone who's a specialist in spiders. He kept commenting that, well, that's not a real spider. That's not, it doesn't look like this. There's no type of spider of these colors. And the patient was not there at all because he was facing his fear. And we had the spider, like a dog, would follow you, which the spider don't do. But the patient was able to say at the end of the few sessions, well, if I can face a spider like that, I can definitely squeeze one with a tissue. So again, it's the magic of emotions. Emotions are not logical by definition. So if you can trigger the emotion, you don't need perfect presence or perfect realism. You need sufficient. And that depends on each type of problem. There's a study done in Liège, in Belgium, with addiction. And even though there's no alcohol triggered, showing bottles of beer would trigger reactions of craving in people who were addicted to alcohol. And even though it was not their typical brand or their preferred brand, it still worked because for someone who crave alcohol, at some point, I need a beer. So it may not be the best one, but I need one. So again, people who look at this from the artistic point of view or the critic's point of view will say, well, it's not perfect. It's not. But keep looking at it through the eyes of the people who have a specific relationship or a problem with that type of stimuli, and then you would see that it does work. So having a nice environment is cool, it's beautiful, it's a better seller if you sell a product. But in terms of treatment efficacy and effectiveness, it's not necessary. What you need is a good understanding of each mental disorder so you would develop the environment with the right content and then have the ability to present that to the patient. So for anxiety, they learn safety. Um, so it's say, and people in my training, people were often asking whether psychotherapy is an art or a science. To me, it's the wrong question. To me, psychotherapy is a science applied with art. The science tells you that for anxiety disorders, you need exposure. Well done exposure, but that's the art of it, is how you do that when it's time to push, not push, wait till the next meeting or the next session, have homeworks or different things. And it's progressive. You respect the pace of the participant, of the patient. And as you're getting to more complex anxiety disorders, away from phobias, but up, for example, to post-traumatic stress disorder, there's tons of other key ingredients in the treatment. So exposure is still relevant, but it's embedded in um, more complex therapeutic strategies to make sure that patients are ready to do the exposure and it's well received and it leads again to perception of safety.
And I guess part of that exposure within a therapy room where the psychotherapist is there with the client or the patient, it means that they can visualize the or see the reaction rather than say, like you were talking about, if someone's an alcoholic, to actually walk down an aisle with them takes a lot of time and energy. So if you actually witness what they're going through, you can then adapt the therapy accordingly right then and there, rather than having to then go away and lead them to their own
Absolutely.
devices and go for it into the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're in control, or essentially you try to be in control as a therapist in those situations. And for example, with gambling addiction, uh, if you have a patient with gambling addiction, we need to go to places they can gamble. And sometimes you would probably want them to bet a bit of money, but if they win a lot, you might be in trouble. It's cool, they won, but now you make trigger more reaction. And if they lose a lot, well, then it get more depressed. So in VR, you have more control. So you can remain in the safety zone, only go where you want to go when the patient is ready, and when you judge as a mental health professional, that's a good thing to do. Um,
And
and
that's where the
again,
art comes in.
exactly, that's where the art comes in.
Yeah, which is part of the experience and um, history of your ability or your ability as a therapist and your yeah, the
Yeah,
expertise that you have in this and
yeah.
maybe how you've done it.
Yeah, I often say in my training, if you're a good psychotherapist, you'll make good use of VR and probably better use, well, treatment will probably be better effective. But if you're a bad therapist, you can do lots of damage with VR if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So VR is a tool for mental health treatments. It's not a goal in itself, it's a tool. And if I might say, that's why I every time I have the chance, I try to push this information that personally, I'm very reluctant to use the expression VRET that you'll see oftentimes is virtual reality exposure therapy or VRET or VRET. And I'm strong militant against that for a few reasons. Because VRET suggests that VR is important. VR is not. VR is a way to create a context. What is important is what you will do with that context. There's been spiders for millions of years and haven't cured anyone, so it's not the thing, it's what you do with it. Second, VR means virtual, and virtual exposure therapy suggests that the exposure is virtual. The stimuli are virtual, but the exposure is real. People are going through the real distress, and as a mental health professional, it's important to accompany the patients with that, with success, not encouraging avoidance, or the art of doing exposure. And VRT also suggests that the exposure is the treatment. And again, it's misleading because, as I said before, we need a good understanding. We need to tailor the treatment to everyone's specific needs to figure out why and how they avoid, and then help them accompany them in that process Then we need to build an alliance. Then we need to share information. So it's more than exposure. It is true that for specific phobias, exposure is the essence of the treatment. It's not, the only thing, but you need to go through that. So I can understand why when the early developers of VR created VRTs for spiders or fear flying or whatever. But now we make treatments are more complex. Again, obsessive-compulsive disorder, GAD, PTSD. Well, it's way more than exposure. So it's not exposure therapy. And the last point is exposure therapy differs from addictions to anxiety disorders to body image. If you don't like your body image, we do create here virtual environments where you can see different bodies and kind of compare yourself, or you can experience the different body sizes and live what it is to be that. So you'll kind of live the body as an experience, not as an object, but as a subject. You're still exposing yourself, but for different reasons, with different goals. It's not safety you're looking for. It's not learning control. So exposure would vary. So I'm much more comfortable with CBT with exposure done in VR. I know it's a long acronym, but VRET is a misnomer, and it leads to the impression that VR is a treatment. It's a pretty good seller if you're probably selling gadgets, but if you understand what you're doing, it's just a tool that is part of a form of treatment that needs to be well adapted to each one.
Even though it's a new tool, it's still a tool. It's one of
It's still a tool.
in your
Yeah.
toolbox.
Yeah. And what I'm afraid is that in some future, people will buy VRET goggles and expect to be treated with that and then come back dissatisfied and push the whole thing aside. Exposure, VR, saying it doesn't work. Well, it's more complicated than that. It's not a simple thing. A bit like when we talk about artificial intelligence and we have the impression that it is intelligent. It's not. It's just a term that is used, but it convey a meaning. And I'm insisting, because I'm lucky I have the opportunity with the podcast to say that VRET or VRET is a risky business because it carries the wrong meaning to the population, and we're not helping the field in the future years.
I agree. Thank you for clarifying that. It's a good point. There's so many nuances that we don't think about until someone explains what it is. So thank you. You've done quite a lot of research around VR as a medical tool for pain management during bone marrow biopsy and also for managing pediatric headaches using biofeedback. Can you talk a bit more about what these are and how effective VR is in medical treatments and how it kind of works?
Yeah, there's been hundreds of studies now on virtual reality and pain. Not so much on chronic pain, we'll talk about migraine, but mostly on acute pain. And we know that if you hit your thumb with a hammer and you look at it, you're going to perceive it as more painful. Doesn't mean that if you don't look at it, it will disappear. But if we pay more attention to our pain, we feel more of our pain. And pain is a little bit like Wi-Fi. There's a bandwidth, and if it's all filled with pain, you'll experience it. But if we reduce the bandwidth with other material that is required your attention, you feel less pain. And that's the example of hypnosis, for example. Hypnosis does work to control pain. So there's ways to distract people from pain in terms of content and sort of process. And virtual reality is a good tool for that. So it's been used for initially severe burn patients. We did that in an emergency with children for venipunctures and as a distraction tool for several applications. People who have cancer and need to go to chemotherapy could put VR goggles and feel they're somewhere else. And by being present somewhere else, less being attending or giving less attention to their painful stimuli, and also being immersed, meaning probably seeing less of the surroundings and the needles and all those things, it reduces pain. So that is an analgesia or analgesic effect of pain. So it does work, it's replicated, and there's tons of studies now in the world, well done randomized control trial, and so on. And there's really good and effective tools that are available in Europe, in Canada, for children, adults, and the elderly as well. For chronic pain, it's a bit different because we're less into distraction or reducing the bandwidth of attention. So for chronic pain, it's a bit different. So we did a study again, as you mentioned. Well, the study was done by a group of researchers in Liège in Belgium, but we were involved in that. And we combined it with biofeedback. So in that study, children who have migraine, we know that if you practice biofeedback and you can reduce your arousal, it has a positive effect on pain. But it's kind of easy to relax when you're with a mental health professional. It's more difficult to relax and practice relaxation when you're stressed. Where as a kid, you're in the classroom giving an oral talk. When you're at the cafeteria and you talk with your friends, and then there's a lot of sounds and music. And so the idea was to practice relaxation in VR so they can learn the skills through the biofeedback, then get the biofeedback. So it was a nice little butterfly. And the butterfly, the calmer you were or you are, the more active and nice the butterfly is, and the more colorful it is, and the more stressed you are, it's getting calmer and darker and more less joyful. So we don't, not sad, but less joyful. And the idea was to practice that in the therapist's office and then to get to more stressful situation that you can practice in VR. So now we're looking at generalization. We practice something in an easy context and in a more complicated context. And so we can generalize to different contexts. We did the same thing with stuttering, for example, in children and young adults. So you practice it when it's easy in VR, and then we increases the level of challenges through the virtual environment to make it more stressful so people can practice. And for pain, again, we have this impression that people can try out new behaviors that they're afraid to do. For example, there's something we call pain behavior and pain catastrophizing and fear of pain. These are all psychological variables that relate to pain and could be worked in VR to try new situations, to learn it's not as threatening, or to try movements that you realize that you thought you could not do, but now you can do, and journalize it again through the variety of contexts provided by the immersion.
So biofeedback, I'm kind of taking your example of the butterfly. Is that meaning that if the VR or whatever the mechanisms are reading my stress levels and give me a visual representation of those stress levels and I can see it rather than having to try and figure out how I feel it, I
Yeah,
can see
exactly.
it and then I can monitor and regulate my emotions or try and find ways to regulate my emotions and I can see visually how that's changing. Do you
Exactly.
think that that's similar to, because you spoke in the beginning about when you see a cut, that actually that's more painful. So is that
Mhm.
also a way, a kind of form of biofeedback, or is it just really the visual representation of,
It's the awareness of the wound in terms of a cut or
yeah,
the nociceptive stimuli, the source of the pain. And because we attend more to pain, there's more bandwidth for the pain receptors to go to the pain interpretation in the brain and so on. So there's a lot of research in psychological medicine about the role of attention. And again, I'm not saying that if someone is in pain, it's all in their mind. I'm just saying that when you're in pain and you focus on your pain, it's worse. And if you focus less on it, you sometimes even get to the point where it's possible at least to experience less, but sometimes even to forget it. And that's the notion there. As you said very well, the idea of biofeedback is a feedback on your biology. So there's something visual, or it could be sound or other systems that inform you on one of your body functions. It could be muscle tension, or it could be level of arousal. And then you kind of see your heart rate or your heartbeat or how stressed you are. So you get an immediate response when you practice relaxation. And you can say, oh, okay, this is how I do it best for me. So you can tailor the relaxation how it's best for you. And then if you go to these more challenging environments through immersions in classroom or a daycare center or wherever, uh, then the mental health professional can pour more stress, and then you would see the rise. So you would see biofeedback tool or the butterfly, getting more stressed again. Oh, so hits a cue. This is a cue I need to practice. Okay, and then people get, you not necessarily become more aware of the signs the body you're telling, or your body's telling, are telling, but you pick up more rapidly on these signs and have more confidence that yes, that's what I have to do me to get more relaxed. So how relaxation is good for you might be slightly different for me, and how I practice it in a stressful situation, again, it's different. So we can practice it, develop more a sense of mastery that I can do that, and that's self-efficacy, that's perceived control, and these are all variables that lead to less pain.
Yeah, so it's linking the emotion and how I'm feeling, whether it's more anxious or less anxious, and whatever it is that's making me anxious, but what is reducing that anxiety, and practicing how those things interlink. So
exactly. And as a last example, we're now running a clinical trial with the Inuit population. So the Inuit population are indigenous people from the north of Canada, but Greenland and north of Scandinavia. And Inuit, well, we worked with them to develop the virtual environments, but Inuit would tell us that, for example, two things. For them, we talk too much when we do psychotherapy. We, as a culture, myself being a, let's say, European or white male person, but we talk too much. So they wanted to have a therapy that is less oriented on talk, but that we can talk while doing something. So if we talk while working on a canoe or talk while walking, we're not confronting each other. We're not talking while doing something. And second, there was a relationship with nature. So we designed this virtual environment where the psychotherapy would take place in a virtual place where we would be doing something while talking, and the surrounding, the snowstorm, the blizzard, will be signs of the stress experienced by the patient. So if he or she is more stressed, they would see the snow falling and then the blizzard coming and more wind. And so less, worse weather. So they then can feel that they are in a relationship with the environment, which is significant value for them, and actually get this sign of biofeedback. So it's kind of orienting or shifting the attention away from the dualistic, or not dualistic, but face-to-face. It's not confrontational, but still that mode of therapy to talk while doing, and the environment reacting to my body emotion. So it's biofeedback at a different level, but we're trying to adapt the treatment to cultural differences. And that's another thing that VR allows us to do.
Last time when we chatted about tele-psychotherapy from a video conferencing perspective, we spoke quite a bit about stress and anxiety, and you spoke earlier on in this podcast about how VR helps with PTSD and phobias, anxiety and panic disorders. So in terms of tele-psychotherapy, because in Canada you were talking about how there's people who geographically struggle to get to therapy, or they've emotionally and mentally can't get to into a therapist's office. But I'm assuming that VR requires a patient to be in an office environment. Do you think generally VR can help with the similar conditions to telepsychotherapy? Is it different? Is it easier? Is it better? So where are the advantages is what I'm trying to question. I'm really kind of getting to. What are the advantages of VR-based therapy versus telepsychotherapy in terms of stress, anxiety, panic disorders, all that stuff?
Telepsychotherapy would be increasing access if you are in a remote situation, or if for whatever reason you cannot attend physically. So you can be not remote, but just it's the bad timing, or it's not optimal for you or the therapist. So it's access, but we don't change much the nature of the therapy. In virtual reality, access is an element, and I'll come to that in a second, but it's more we can tailor the environment or the emotional experience so it leads to safety or learning control, the feeling of control. So it's more tailoring the emotional relationship, the emotional situation that could happen, as opposed to telepresence. So we thought initially that that would make treatment more attractive, and it does. If you offer people the chance between facing their fears in virtual reality or in vivo, in real life situation, people would prefer virtual reality. So it's more attractive. But then we need to get to people, and it needs that everyone needs their head mount display, their VR goggles, which not everyone has. It's cumbersome, it's complicated. You need to put that in your face. Some people have goggles, it fits, doesn't fit. You need either it's either wired to a computer, you need a computer, or it's not. So then the technology makes it less actually accessible for now. Decades ago, it was expensive. You need special computers. Now it's not free, but it's not that expensive. It is affordable, and the average VR systems are like 10 times better than what we had when I started doing this research in 1999. So technology is getting better. It's more accessible, but it's still a bit cumbersome to use. Um, so so there's the cost of the hardware. There's you're handling the hardware, and just because some people don't like tech, and then you receive a box with goggles, but what do I do with that? Uh, then there's the matter of the software and the therapist. We'll talk with this therapist first. Uh, some psychotherapists are not really too keen about tech. We're talking about cyber psychologists now, but some people don't like tech. They're afraid it's going to put something between them and the patient, hinder the working alliance. It's not true, but you need to try it to be convinced of that. Or look at the papers. But still, it's a concern. And then, well, why the hell would I bother with VR so I can get a spider? So again, we go back to the advantage of better control. It increases generalization. You can have spiders of different sizes. You can have crowds of different groups of people. You can practice different things. So it makes treatment more replicable, more generalizable. And if you push exposure, it could make the treatment actually indeed more effective. But there's kind of reluctance for therapists of, well, I wouldn't say older therapists, but we see less in the younger generation who grew up more with tech. So we're getting there. Then there's the matter of the software. Uh, you need a software to create the virtual content. If you want to do a PowerPoint presentation, you want images, you go on Google, whatever, you take images, whether you have the right or not, a different topic, but it's easy to get a nice PowerPoint presentation. It's easy. We're not there yet for VR environment. You have someone, you need to have the software, you need to pay for it, you need to access it, and then you need to learn. So that's also another kind of factor that contributes to a bit of a resistance. Uh, Initially, it was complicated. Now it's getting more affordable. The software easier to use. So that's less and less of a problem. But now there's a new problem or a new challenge. It's a free market and it's not regulated. So anyone could invent a software or copy the software, the Excel software on another company and put it on the market. And there's no way to know whether it's good or not. So people need that look at science, understand that you don't need perfect presence. So if I'm selling you a product saying, well, because it's more realistic, it's going to be more effective, I don't know my science. I may be a good seller, but you need to know your clinical science and how people process information. It's also tempting to sell tools that seems effective or at least attractive for patients. For example, a tool that would help you relax while confronting what you're afraid of. And if we agree that anxiety is perception of threat and avoidance maintains it, it means that when you're afraid, as a professional, you should help your patient, not avoid. And if I do relaxation at the same time, I might be avoiding because it is perceived from the patient's point of view as a coping strategy is not to panic too much, to stay in control. So my amygdala, my limbic system, is not learning that it's not dangerous. It's not only learning that it needs to be controlled and it needs to relax. Wrong message. So a tool that does VR and I would sprinkle avoidance into it is leading to less effective treatment. And you need to be knowledgeable of that. And the engineers may not be. AI is coming. AI, artificial intelligence, would provide will make it easier to develop VR content, but also because it's a free world, there's no rules and regulation on what's good or not. Cyberpsychologists need to be more aware of what's backed up by science and what fits the clinical needs, and not just the nice design and the cool tools and the bells and whistles that you would have. So patients are the target, the key. We need to understand what's happening in their lives and how we can best address that. And if technology is relevant, then we can add that to the treatment to have a more effective treatment.
And it goes back to what we were saying before. It's about using the right tools in the right situation, and with the therapist with the right experience that understands the nuances of what the tools are required and what kind of exposure therapy and what programs do or don't work. So
Absolutely.
yeah, there's all that experience. We've spoken briefly about behaviors, and especially we've spoken about gambling, we've spoken about alcoholism and drug addiction. And you've studied and written about VR in relation to behavioral issues such as pathological gambling, sexual offences, and obsessive-compulsive disorders. And we know these behaviors can be changed, but they're often viewed as society as kind of a personal flaw that someone has. And they kind of question they think the person is kind of broken. We see them as being broken and not fixable. But so in terms of these behaviors and the use of VR to help these patients, how effective is VR in the treatment of changing these behaviors with people with these kind of issues?
VR is part of the set of effective tools to address these issues or disorders, and we'll get into more nuances in a minute. But I don't want to say that VR is the gold standard treatment and it's perfect, and I don't want to convey. So you see how I'm kind of I'm kind of getting in there slowly. The same thing for everything. There's no tool that is perfect for all disorders. So we know from repeatedly published from different groups, randomized control trial, that it works for phobias, it works for social anxiety, it works for panic, it works for agoraphobia. Once we get to obsessive-compulsive disorder, we have studies showing that it works, but we don't have the same amount of randomized control trial, just because we're not there yet. So it's getting published progressively. There's a group in Prague, there's a group in Seoul, Korea, there's a group in different parts of the world that are working on that. For example, for OCD. For gambling addiction, the same thing. For sexual addictions as well. So we go back to the development of these tools the development of these disorders is we observe behaviors, and you said, well, it's like people are broken. Well, these behaviors occur or develop progressively through a cycle of events that make me, for example, for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people will slowly engage in avoidance. Again, because I'll take this one because it's consistent given the time we have. But it's, again, avoiding intrusive thoughts, these crazy thoughts that I have that I'm going to push people in front of the subway or the tube, or do something dangerous, or hit someone with a knife, or I need to wash my hands. But these thoughts, intrusive thoughts, we all have them. But some people give them more meaning, and the thoughts are perceived as threatening. Then it leads to avoidance. And if you avoid these thoughts, well, when they come back, they're still perceived as threatening. And sometimes if you're really good at avoiding it, like, for example, washing your hands all the time to get less germs, well, it's another cycle, because once your hands will feel dirty, you'll be afraid of having the germs. So there's a cycle that involves the brain. And this is where I think the broken thing comes in the population. Given my age, people don't see me if they're watching listening to the podcast, but I'm not 60, but I'll be in a few years. So there was for a long time this impression that the brain was like an engine, a motor, and if something is broken, if a neuron is broken, it's damaged forever. And just the example of OCD, 1994, a study done in England showed that if you do brain images of people who have OCD, you'll see the area of the brain that don't seem to work as you would expect, they hyperactivated or lower activated. But then if you do effective psychotherapy, effective cognitive behavior therapy, these areas of the brain starts functioning normally again. So it's not a brain is not damaged. The brain is actually adapting to our environments. So, and it's what we call plasticity of the brain. So it evolves. So if I engage in some behaviors and going back to the limbic system, the amygdala, my amygdala will react as if it's perceived as dangerous, blah, blah, blah. You'll see the whole reactions. And my behavior will maintain that. And then people say, well, there's a brain dysfunction in my brain. I'm broken. Well, we know now for all these other anxiety disorders that if we change our behavior and learn to deal with these emotions through therapeutic work, for example, or medication, but there's drawbacks. There's no perfect solutions, but then these areas of the brain that are supposed to be broken can readjust its function normally. And if they function normally, well, the emotions become more adaptive and the behavior becomes more adaptive. So it's something that could change. And VR is really good to change these disorders because in the virtual environment, again, we can, like a puppeteer, control the environment. We don't control the people, but we control the environment where we put them in some emotionally charged context. So change could occur progressively with therapeutic help and so on. And then even though the stimuli are fake, we can bluff the brain through the fact that the limbic system reacts too quickly. And actually the brain can learn safety or new habits or and more adaptive desires and reaction and change.
Talking about the brain, you kind of spoke about plasticity of the brain, neuroplasticity. And you also do quite a bit of VR research into dementia and neurocognitive issues. What benefits do those with dementia gain from VR? And the second part of the question is what type of neurocognitive issues can VR be used for?
Okay, two different topics. We'll take the neurocognitive disorder first because it fits probably more directly with what we're talking. Some labs in the world, including Cynthia Guimont in my lab and other professors working on schizophrenia, were trying to develop cognitive remediation skills. So you can practice to do things that are a challenge for you. And then we can practice doing it live and then in VR and then increase again the level of difficulty or challenges. So it would hopefully generalize to day-to-day situations. Or we can use virtual reality for neurological assessment, and that's been done quite a lot. So we can do assessments that in more, what we call it, ecologically valid, more representative situations that are more representative of the surroundings of day-to-day life. So there's a few things at least we could do in VR, assessment, and then re-education, rehab, and then cognitive rehab. But these are fields in development. In terms of dementia, I have not seen studies targeting VR to quote unquote treat dementia. But I've seen people doing that using VR for the assessment of signs of dementia, early signs of dementia, mild cognitive impairment, which is like early signs of dementia. So on that range of assessment, what we did in our lab that you were alluding to is we developed with a group here in Ottawa a companion, so an artificial intelligence-based virtual character called Kira, and she's using artificial intelligence and generative AI, the most recent tools, to help people talk. But it's not like a friend. She would foster reminiscence, and we know that people who have memory loss or with dementia, reminiscence, recalling stories about her past and or my past and talking about it is good. It has a positive impact on memory. It has a positive on mood and depression and loneliness and so on. So Kira's was designed not to talk to you about the weather. She will take the weather if you talk about the weather, but she'll bring it back to you. So that was at least a way to foster reminiscence and the feeling of being someone who's interested in us and what we're going through. And we don't have to worry too much about Kira providing the wrong information. What's the day? Christmas is the 25th or whatever. I'm picking this one because I know no one cares about that. So there's no socially delicate issues. But she would not mind these details about politics, about wars, about so this companion is not taking us on that route, but more on what do you feel today? What might make you feel good today? Tell me more about it. So more supportive and going towards reminiscence. And we shown that we can design such a tool. And in our publication, we kind of wouldn't show the recipe, but the methodology we learned before the generative AI became popular, when it became popular, now how you're using it, and how people with dementia are comfortable using the technology. So but essentially it's providing support. So we hope to help these people feel less loneliness and less solitude and have opportunities to work on reminiscence. And we also have to take into account all these ethical problems because they're not talking with a real person. So is it ethical or not? So all of this is discussed in some of the publications we did as well.
I heard someone say once, and I think it was on a TED talk, that those who feel like as though they're part of a social circle or have someone who cares for them actually tend to live longer than someone who feels lonely. And loneliness is one of those things that it's almost, there's a parallel between loneliness and early life ending. Um, so is that part of using the
Yeah,
AI tools is all about feelings of companionship, feelings of not feeling alone, especially when you're losing your memory and feeling like you are separated out from others.
exactly. And to quote the doctor, the neurologist, and the team, Andrew Frank, the Kira is someone with infinite patience. So she's kind with infinite patience, and we humans don't have it. So at some point, it's becoming challenging to go on to visit people that don't recognize you or tell the same story over and over again. But a virtual companion like that is designed to have infinite patience, and that's pretty useful for that specific application.
Yeah. And to make them feel as though there's someone who's listening to them or
Exactly.
something that's listening to them, but they might see it as someone. So feel heard, which is
Yeah,
such an important part of being human, is feeling heard and valued.
and valued and
Yeah,
feeling supported and so on. Yeah, absolutely.
fantastic. There are a small proportion of people who feel sickness in VR. It's kind of almost like a seasickness. What proportion of users of VR feel this, are affected by this? And are there things that they could do to reduce the amount of sickness that they feel in VR?
Yeah. So there's a term commonly used which called cyber sickness, which I would prefer to define as unwanted negative symptoms induced by immersions in VR, which is so long that cyber sickness fits the role. But it's unwanted symptoms, so it's not a sickness. Um, and yes, it happens. We'll need to talk about that. And sometimes happen even to cyber psychologists watching people immersed in VR. So about 10% of the population would say that they're so dizzy in virtual environments that they need to stop it. They have to stop. And about 10% of the population would say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no unwanted feelings, whatever, or emotions or whatever coming to me on zero cyber sickness. And the rest of the population is somewhere along this line between the two ends of the 10%. So what are the symptoms? You can split them in two broad groups. There are those who are related to wearing the system, the material, the goggles. So if the goggles are heavy, it might feel like heaviness. If they're too tight, it might feel like I had my headache. So kind of, if you know what you're doing as a therapist, it shouldn't happen too much. There's also the fact that you're watching in front of your eyes. You've got these two little TV monitors thick in front of your eyes, and because of that, your eyes are not moving much. And if they're not moving much, it's like working on a computer in front of the screen without stop watching the computer for say 20 minutes or an hour. You might get an headache because of that. So that's why people would recommend like good ergonomics that after every 20, 30 minutes, you'd like remove the goggles and go look away. So at least the eyes could move a little bit. So you don't get too much eye strain. So there's related to the equipment or cleaning the equipment. You want to clean that before patients, especially if they sweat a lot during exposure. You need to clean it. Common sense, but so there's this group of symptoms or unwanted side effects that do happen less and less, but it's there. And the other group is related to nausea. And that's what most people usually comment about. Um, and the nausea is a bit like um, motion sickness. And actually, if people are really highly sensitive to motion sickness, they usually fell in the 10% that are highly reacting to the virtual environments with sickness and nausea. The idea with uh, there's motion sickness, and think of seasickness as well. We'll talk about it. Um, if you are in a car and the car is moving and you're reading, your eyes will see the letters in the book you're reading, but your inner ear would perceive the motion of the car stopping and moving. So you have two informations going through your brain. One is I'm not moving because I don't see movement in my eyes. And then there's this movement from the system that is related to equilibrium, the inner ear system. Plus, you might see some movements on the peripheral field of view, which is contributing to that. So when there's a decoupling between what you see and the movement, there's the hypothesis is that over million of years ago, it's probably because you've eaten something poisonous and you need to get rid of it. So it leads to nausea and to vomiting. It's the same thing when people drink too much. And then you stop moving your head, and you have the impression the head keeps moving and come back. You go into bed and it's spinning. That's it's quite clear symptom of something needs to get out. And we have the same thing in seasickness. So you're in a boat and then there's waves. But after a while, on a boat, most people would tend to see that the seasickness disappear. It's actually the brain like removing the waves from the movement. So now you don't feel this motion of the water. And what is cool, if when you get out of the boat, people would get down with earth sickness, which is actually going back. And then you have an impression that it's moving again for a few times because the subtraction the brain did. Now, when you're on land, you don't have it. And you feel like this moving little thing a bit. And then it adjusts. So it shows that the brain adjusts, which is again to plasticity. But when you are in the virtual environment, if you move your head around, your inner ear will detect the head rotation. But if the computer is slow or the environment is too highly charged, we'll come to that. Uh, the computer needs to work to detect the head rotation that is signaled by the tracker, send the information, and in VR, stimuli are recreated in real time. So, for example, I'm talking to you there. I can't see behind my camera, so in VR it would not be recreated. But if I stand up and watch, it will recreate the stimuli. So the computer is working all the time, and the time it times to work and send the information back to the eyes could create a lag or a delay. And if there's a significant delay because between what I perceive as a rotation, so my inner ear, my proprioception, and what I see, there's the decoupling in senses. And decoupling in senses means probably nausea and so on. So you get to these nausea symptoms. It means that we need to have a sufficiently powerful technology so it doesn't lag. But that's also why, for now, women in VR, virtual characters, have short hairs, for example. Because I see your hair and people are watching it. You see that it moves, and you see, like, I'm kind of jealous because I'm bald and when I don't have any hairs. So, but it's easy for a computer to replicate the movement of my head because it's just a head turning. But in your case, we don't want your head to look bulky and like a big chunk of things. So every thin layer of hair has to be computed and moved. And so to get something realistic, requires a lot of power for the computer. If that a lot of power, lots of computing, potentially a lot of cyber sickness. Keep the ears attached or tight. And so that's why there's several decisions made when we design virtual environments that are there to reduce the amount of processing the computer needs to do. So more realism could be nicer, but it also could also lead to more cyber sickness because just more computing. So there's a trade-off there when people design virtual environments about all these things. But for a cyber therapist, you need to be aware that some hardware could create some sickness, so be careful with that. And that when people move and look around and turn their head and jump, or they are driving a virtual car or virtual bicycle, or they do mountain rides or train rides, or when there's motion that doesn't fit what you see, it could lead to cyber sickness, especially in people who are highly sensitive to car sickness or to motion sickness. So we would reduce that, A, by informing people beforehand. If you feel sick, let me know. B, by watching them. If they're spinning their head around, they might get sick. Or the therapist might see that and just, my eldest son play video games. And when he plays video games, he's like moving all around. And just by watching at his computer screen, I get kind of dizzy to follow this movement. So, the idea is, yes, it creates some cyber sickness, not on everyone, but there's some practice guidelines that we built. Don't get intoxicated, don't come intoxicated. You shouldn't come intoxicated in therapy, but don't come intoxicated. If you're highly sensitive to motion sickness, let us know. VR may not be a good idea. If you feel sick, let me know. We'll stop. There's no point of going further in the experience. When you remove the goggles, stick with the patient for another-ish 20 minutes. I don't mean after the therapy session, but after removing the goggles. So usually we remove the goggles and when we talk about what happened, and then we schedule the next appointment, and then the 15, 10 minutes, 20 minutes are done. But if you don't do that, you go back to the land sickness or the earth sickness. When you go out of the boat, your brain needs to adjust. So when you remove the goggles, some people might have to readjust. You don't want people to take their bicycle, cross the street, then fall, and then being hit by the car because they didn't have that time to readjust. So it's not dangerous. It's just practice post-VR, post-immersion is VR. Take some time to just make sure his fingering is fine. And 99% of your patients will be fine if that's not a problem. And some nuance, some studies done in our lab and in the Netherlands, and one, I think also in Australia, we've shown that, at least in my lab, patients have more cyber sickness before than after therapy, after immersion, which doesn't make sense. But lots of the symptoms of cyber sickness would be heart rate that is increasing high, sweatness, tension, which is what happened during VR for immersion for anxiety disorder. And we're picking up as apprehension pre-treatment because they know what's going to happen. So it's important to document and measure VR pre and post. So sometimes it does decrease. And in a study we published 2 years ago, we induced stress without any VR. And we can see that all the symptoms of stress, of course, would increase, but several symptoms of VR, of cyber sickness also increased. So if you look at that or you do research on this, be mindful that some symptoms are just part of what we do in therapy. And if you induce exposure, induce fear, well, people might feel a little bit stressed in the end. It's not a cyber sickness. It's not even unwanted symptoms of the immersion. It's just a side effect of the exposure.
Thank you for explaining that, because I actually am one of those 10% who do get cyber sickness. And there's some programs in VR where I'm fine, but it's when you're standing around, just kind of with a group of people, it's fine. But when you're in a game or moving around, that's when I start getting ill really quickly or feeling nauseous. And I didn't realize, and it's logical when you explain it, but I didn't realize about the difference in what you're seeing and what you're perceiving from a motion perspective. That makes loads of sense. And also the other thing is when I do start feeling nauseous, I lose presence.
Yep.
So
it's correlated negatively. Clearly.
Yeah. So I no longer feel that I'm there. I'm so busy trying to fight the nausea when I'm in VR that I'm no longer actually physically, mentally present in that VR environment. So yeah, and I agree with you. You kind of need to monitor your patients, because if they start feeling nausea, then actually the therapy is no longer working. really,
Exactly.
because
Yep.
they're not there, they're not feeling the presence and not getting the effect of it. You spoke earlier about children or younger people being more receptive to things like VR, and your research covers the lifespan from young people all the way through to dementia and older people. So do you find that younger people are more open to using the newer forms of technology or tools for therapeutic interventions than older people?
Yes, but so we published a few studies on VR with children. Children love VR. They're amenable to it. They could do the exposure, whatever. But we also find some unexpected results. And I love what we don't find what we expect as researchers, because this is when we learn, or we'll learn the most. And we found that for some phobias, insects, spiders especially, but others, uh, critters and little insects and so on, uh, there's more apprehension in children than in children and adolescents than adults. So in one of our study, to make it simple, but in one of our study, children were either exposed to a live tarantula during the treatment, which is a real big spider, and in virtual reality, spiders. And children preferred the live tarantula, which is kind of a counterintuitive. But you look at the motivation, it's just because the spiders were behind doors or not visible, and were expecting really big, disgusting, dangerous spiders. That relates to their imagination, what they see in movies, what they see on TV, and they may not have the awareness, the full awareness of what psychologists would do or not. Um, so when it could be monsters like spiders, for example, we now recommend that we should show images of the spider in the virtual environment. This is what it looks like. Oh, it's not just that. Oh, no problem. But they're not aware of what would be behind the door, and because of their imagination, they were more apprehensive than adults would be. But we don't find it in social anxiety, for example, in school refusals of other applications or in pain application. So it seems to be specific to, I'd say, potential monsters, something they've seen that could apprehend through media exposure, movies, and so on. And then we just need to show them what it will look like. But as a therapist, you need to be aware of that, because they all prefer exposure in VR, but sometimes not. And then says, well, oh, what the hell? Well, it could be explained, and it has been explained by more apprehension.
That's fascinating because it's not so much about the technology, it's about how they see things in their or imagine things in their head before going into the therapy and how they then translate that.
The key, my one of my strongest belief and the key message I keep mentioning is you need to understand your psychopathology and how you do your therapy, and then you use the technology. And the technology makes wonders. But
Yeah.
if you don't understand that, you'll be misled by lots of information they could see on TikTok or on people who think they know. But the science has been there for a long time, because I keep saying also that the first study we did was 1999. So people were doing research in VR in early 90s. So it's not new. And oftentimes people look at only research from the last 5 years. Well, there's been tons of knowledge over decades. And I think it's important to build on that as opposed to reinvent the wheel all the time.
Yeah, agree. We do fall into that trap as academics. We only look at the last 5 years, especially in cyberpsychologists. We go, oh, the last 5 years are the most important. But actually, the last 5 years have been built on the last 25 years. So, and we need those basic foundational bits as well. You've mentioned a few times the company that you developed for your VR, In Virtuo, I think it was called, and it's a for-profit company that you sell VR programs through for therapy, and then you push the funds back into your lab. Can you talk a little bit more about this and just explain how that works?
Oh, yeah, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially you transfer the intellectual property to the reseller. In my case, it's me to me, so it's simple. But it allows us as a company, because usually companies are there to grow business. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, that's how the world works. And that's not our company's goal. Our company's goal is to make sure that whatever we develop in the clinic and in the lab actually doesn't die on shelves, but gets out to the public. So public fund could actually be used abroad in Canada and across the planet. So that's kind of a company where we're not pushing on promotion, but people write to us, and I must ensure that people are mental health professionals. So because these tools, spiders are nice, but we do have environment for post-traumatic stress disorder. You don't want to play with these emotionally tools, and more the tools that could create emotionally challenging content. Um, but essentially, we ensure the distribution to get the word out. And it's a challenge because, well, there's lots of other companies, that's fine, lots of good competitors, but also those who don't know what they're making and it tries to push to sell, and then 5 years later, they're not there. Um, so there's those who make it something nicer, but it's not really credible in terms of science. And there's the problem of keeping up to date. And that's a killer because, well, Windows makes updates regularly, but companies like Meta and others are making their own updates. So the virtual environments we developed initially, we had to, when they were all designed before the Meta and Oculus came in. So we had to redo the 24 environments when the Meta Oculus came in because it wasn't compatible anymore. So you need to redo them. And then they came with a new protocol that would allow all companies or all product to be compatible. So we need to redo it the third time. And now Apple is coming, and it probably will lead to some change. So it's a challenge to remaining competitive and survive in a world where the technology is expanding so fast that we can't cope. And uh, companies usually they see an idea or they want to develop a market, and the point is to get the market right and be the first and then develop it. Uh, in academia, we're slow. We take years. We do develop. We go through the ethics, and then we do this, and then we do that. So my experience, or something I've seen, is a shift of paradigm. For decades, researchers were leading the way, and we do that because it's expensive, and but then no one can afford using it. But at least we could show that. And now, the driving force is becoming the companies and the corporations who are putting things on the market because they think it's good. And now researchers, academics have to think, okay, but is it really good? And then we need to open the box and check how to do that and what kind of information are they collecting on us, sharing on us. Or, yeah, you can do biofeedback and combine it with relaxation to do exposure. And that's a good sell point. Yes, but that's an avoidance strategy. Don't do that. Well, it's too late because they're selling millions. Hypothetical example. But there's really now this shift on unregulated market, hard to know what's good, and then development being driven by companies, which is fine because we need to develop, but at a much faster pace than the academia can follow and can compete. Um, and this is actually the position we're now in 2024. Maybe in 2 years it'll be quite different. I don't know. But it's challenging to remain functional or alive as a company. And most companies who want to make profit, which is fine, need to sell a lot. And to sell a lot, you need to do the promotion, and it's fine. And the companies that don't sell a lot usually die. So but it's totally different frame than typical randomized control trial academia research. When we take our time, we'll look at variables, we control everything. Um, but it's rich. It's a rich experience because you can see now what people really want, and sometimes therapists what they want is not what the science teach us that they should need, but they want it anyway. So if we want to actually, we should sometimes provide what people need and want at the same time, not just what I think is good. So we need to be informed about patients and the market and everything else. So, and it's growing fast, but it is quite challenging to be in that position right now in the world where it is developing, it's getting accessible to patients and to professionals. So it's quite thrilling.
So, if a professional wants to use some of the VR tools that you have developed, would they get in touch with you directly and chat to you about what they do and what they're wanting to
Yeah.
use it for before you will release it to them and kind of sell it to them so that they can use it as a tool in their therapy practice?
Yes, and if they want to contact me and I want me to do some promotion, but if they want to contact me, they need to contact me through the company email address because I'm a faculty member and we don't want to confuse the fact that I'm now in my office using public funding to talk to you, and now we should not use public funding for profit. Although it comes back to the university, but we're trying to make sure that every element of the potential of conflict of interest or actual conflict of interest is declared, well maintained, and so on. But yes, InVirtuo.com does exist, and people go there and they can contact us and get the virtual environments, um, and gladly to at least inform them. And then there's all the competitors that are going great stuff as well.
Getting back to that you wrote in 2014 a book called Advances in Virtual Reality and Anxiety Disorders. So and it covers a number of areas we've spoken about today. And you have got a lot of research that you have published on ORCID or on your ORCID profile, which is also a link to that in the notes. But if someone is looking for additional information on VR therapy and can't access the academic articles, because a lot of what you've done is not really accessible for obvious reasons because it's academic articles. But are there other sources of information that you can point them to outside of your book that you've written?
Yeah, yes, and half of the most recent article are in open access.
Oh,
So
brilliant.
it is technical, I agree, but it is accessible. The same thing with the other book. I'm just showing the books now, but the one that with Skip Rizzo, which is more recent, but again, it's virtual reality for psychological and neurocognitive interventions. Or we're working on one now. So we're trying to disseminate that. But there are some books that are addressing the general population, for the general population. And one that I like, which is quite acceptable, is called Virtual Healers by Brenda Wiederhold, and it's about researchers and what they did and their profile and history. So it gets a bit of the history of the VR therapy and technologies. Um, and I think the best way is probably to look at podcast or um, documentaries that make VR accessible, because there's quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're redoing the book, because it's been about 10 years, I'd love to have you back on to chat about the book when it's published.
I hope to have we're working on a two-series book that is due to be submitted by February. We'll probably, hopefully, publish at some point in the fall of next year.
Next year.
That would cover, the plan is to cover all disorders, the required technologies, and also the cultural differences. And so I hope it'll be the must-read. I don't want, I hope how we plan the book.
It will definitely be a must read for anyone who's in cyber psychology wants to know about VR therapy. Absolutely. Um,
Thank you.
so a lot of the research that you do within your lab is kind of French, and you look for French participants. So if there is someone who's French speaking and a cyber psychologist who's wanting to get involved in the work that you do in your lab and VR and tele-psychotherapy, is there a way for them to find out more, get in touch with you to chat about opportunities in your lab?
Absolutely, absolutely. The In Virtuo is both English and French. The VR environments are both in English and French, and some of the books I can distribute. Well, not distribute, but I can give the references are available in libraries for free, some of the public library, or people can purchase them, and they're in French. There's less literature in French, sadly, but that's true for Italian and Spanish and other languages, because a lot of the research in VR has been done in Canada, United States, and Spain, and Italy, and Germany. And Australia, but they also speak English, and UK. But I just want to show that make sure that I insist that it's an international domain where people are doing research in their own field, and not mentioning research done in Italy and Spain and Germany and South Korea would not be fair.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Netherlands and then Denmark. But yeah,
Yeah. It's all over the world, really, in so many different languages. It's a kind of a shame that we can't kind of coordinate everything. But I suppose that's where AI comes in to translate everything and make it easily
yeah,
accessible. So there's some really interesting insights in a different language. And I found that when I was doing academic work, is I missed out a huge portion of academic findings because I just don't speak the language and I can't read academic stuff in another language. So I think AI will really change the nature of how we do research going forward. Stéphane, thank you so much for joining me again on Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. It was so fabulous to catch up with you again and explore VR therapies. And I hope that we get to chat again in the future about your book or about anything else that you're doing. And I look forward to seeing what else comes out of your research lab in Canada.
thank you. Thank you very much.